What if I told you that everything you learned about the Wild West was carefully edited before it reached you? That the textbooks skipped the parts that were too strange, too brutal, or too complicated to fit neatly into the legend? You probably picture cowboys in dusty saloons, outlaws with six-shooters, and sheriffs riding into the sunset. Maybe a gold rush, maybe a cattle drive. Clean, simple, cinematic. But here's the thing. The real Wild West was messier, weirder, and 100 times more fascinating than anything Hollywood ever put on a screen. The secrets buried in that era, the ones that got left on the cutting room floor of history, are the ones worth knowing. Every single fact you're about to hear is drawn from historical records, first-hand accounts, and documented research. These aren't myths. These aren't cowboy legends passed down around a campfire. These are the things that actually happened between roughly 1865 and 1900 in one of the most misunderstood eras in American history. So, before we ride out, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like because these deep dives take serious time to put together, and the algorithm doesn't exactly champion slow history. I need your help making sure these stories reach people who actually want to know the truth. Now settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to have almost everything you thought you knew about the Wild West quietly dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. 100 secrets. Some will surprise you, some will disturb you. Some will make you wonder why nobody ever mentioned this in school. Let's head west. 1. Before there was a cowboy, there was a vaquero, and almost everything that made the cowboy iconic, the wide-brimmed hat, the rope, the saddle design, the entire culture of working cattle on horseback, came directly from Spanish and Mexican tradition. When American settlers pushed into Texas and the Southwest, they didn't arrive with a fully formed cattle culture. They borrowed one. The vaquero had been working cattle in what would become the American West for generations, before a single Anglo rancher showed up with ambitions and a land deed. The word rodeo comes from Spanish, so does corral, so does ranch, lasso, chaps, bronco, and stampede. When you picture the cowboy in your head, the one from every movie poster and dime novel, you're looking at a figure assembled almost entirely from traditions that originated south of what later became the border. The American cowboy didn't invent himself. He inherited a craft that had been refined over centuries by men whose names the history books mostly forgot, and the tool most central to that craft had a very specific origin. 2. If the cowboy had a single defining piece of equipment beyond his horse, it was the rope. But the rope that Americans came to call the lariat didn't start out as a lariat at all. It started as the reata, a braided rawhide rope perfected by vaqueros, who had spent generations learning to throw it with precision that was genuinely difficult to believe until you saw it. The word lariat is itself a mangled version of the Spanish la reata. The vaquero's reata was not mass-produced. It was hand-braided, often from 4 to 8 strands of carefully prepared rawhide, and a skilled craftsman might spend weeks on a single rope. The length could reach 60 feet or more, and a talented vaquero could drop a loop over a running animal with accuracy that seemed closer to magic than technique. When Anglo cowboys adopted the rope, they largely moved toward cheaper materials and shorter lengths, partly because the rawhide reata required constant maintenance and was sensitive to moisture in ways that other materials weren't. But the fundamental tool, the loop at the end of a long rope thrown from horseback to control cattle, came directly from the vaquero tradition. The technique, the swing, the release, the follow-through, was taught by Mexican riders to American ones on working ranches across Texas and California. Every time a rodeo competitor throws a lasso today, they are performing a skill that traces in an unbroken line back to the Spanish colonial ranches of the 17th century. The craft travelled north with the cattle, and the cattle travelled north for very practical reasons. 3. The great cattle drives of the Wild West era didn't happen because cowboys loved the open road. They happened because economics made them unavoidable. After the Civil War, Texas ranchers found themselves sitting on enormous herds of longhorn cattle, some of which had gone essentially feral during the war years when nobody was managing them. The problem was that beef in Texas wasn't worth much because everyone in Texas had cattle. Beef in Kansas, Missouri, and points north was worth considerably more, and the expanding railroad network had created shipping hubs where cattle could be loaded onto trains and sent to eastern markets at prices that justified the cost and danger of moving them there. So the drives began. Tens of thousands of cattle pushed north, across hundreds of miles of open range, through river crossings that could kill animals and men, through storms, through drought, through territory where the grass was good, and territory where it wasn't. The economics were straightforward. Buy cattle cheap in Texas, drive them to a railhead in Kansas, sell them for several times what you paid, absorb your losses for the ones that didn't make it, and count yourself ahead. The open range was the entire point. Public land that nobody officially owned meant that feed was free for the taking as long as the grass held. The drives weren't romantic. They were business decisions made by people who had identified a price differential and figured out how to exploit it before the railroad reached Texas and made the whole enterprise unnecessary, which happened faster than most of them expected. But while the drives lasted, certain routes became famous, and some of that fame was not entirely earned. 4. Ask most people to name a cattle trail from the Wild West, and there's a reasonable chance they say the Chisholm Trail. It became the shorthand for everything the cattle drive era represented, a name attached to songs and stories, and a mythology that grew well beyond the actual dirt path that cattle walked. Here's what the history often glosses over. The Chisholm Trail, in its original and most precise definition, was a trading route established by a mixed-heritage Cherokee trader named Jesse Chisholm, who used it to supply goods to Native American settlements in what is now Oklahoma. The cattle industry adopted and extended that route northward to Kansas railheads, but the trail itself largely followed paths that already existed, river crossings that were already known, and corridors through the landscape that generations of indigenous peoples and traders had already identified as practical. The trail's fame also obscures the fact that it shifted constantly. Depending on the year, the conditions, and who was driving, the actual route varied considerably. Farmers began fencing off land along established paths, forcing herds onto new corridors. Drought changed where water could be found. Conflicts with settlers pushed drovers around obstacles. The trail that songs celebrated was never a fixed line on the ground. It was more like a general direction with a famous name attached. And while the Chisholm Trail dominated the cattle trade in its era, other trails shaped the West just as significantly, particularly one that pushed in a very different direction. 5. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving were not the most famous names to come out of the Wild West, but the trail they blazed together in 1866 reshaped the cattle business in ways that the Chisholm Trail never reached. Where most drives pushed north toward Kansas railheads and the Missouri market, the Goodnight-Loving Trail went west and then north, cutting through West Texas into New Mexico and up toward Colorado and eventually Wyoming. The logic was straightforward, and the opportunity was significant. Government contracts to supply beef to Native American reservations in New Mexico and to feed the Union Army in Colorado created a market that nobody else was efficiently serving. Goodnight and Loving identified the gap and built a route to fill it. The trail was brutal in ways that even other cattle drives rarely matched. The first major section crossed the Llano Estacado, a stretch of land so dry and exposed that cattle and men could go nearly 80 miles without reliable water. Loving was wounded by Comanche raiders on an 1867 drive and died from complications of that wound, making him one of the few trail bosses whose death came directly from the violent dangers. The legend always promised but rarely actually delivered. Goodnight carried on, eventually becoming one of the most important ranchers in Texas history, and the trail he built opened western markets to Texas cattle in ways that permanently influenced where the cattle industry expanded. The trail story later inspired Larry McMurtry's novel Lonesome Dove, which meant that for many Americans their understanding of the cattle drive era came filtered through a fictionalized version of this particular route. But fiction tends to age the participants considerably. The reality of who actually worked those trails was younger and considerably harder. 6. The cowboy of American mythology is a man, weathered, experienced, probably somewhere in his 30s or 40s, with a lined face and a quiet authority earned through years in the saddle. The reality was that a significant portion of the workforce that drove cattle across the Wild West was made up of teenagers. Boys as young as 14 and 15 signed on for cattle drives because the pay, while genuinely poor, was more than they could earn doing most other available work, and because there were few barriers to entry beyond the ability to ride and a tolerance for conditions that were objectively miserable. Trail work meant 16 to 18 hours in the saddle on active days, sleeping on the ground in whatever weather arrived, eating food that ranged from monotonous to genuinely bad, and doing it all for wages that typically ran between $25 and $40 a month. The romance of the profession existed almost entirely in the literature written about it afterward, by people who had never worked a cattle drive. The men and boys who actually did it understood it as grueling agricultural labour with a particularly high rate of accidental death, mainly from drowning at river crossings, being caught in stampedes or horse-related accidents of the kind that become fatal when you're 100 miles from the nearest doctor. Many cowboys worked only a few drives before finding other employment. The career path was not long. Bodies aged out of it quickly when they didn't simply break. The teenagers who rode out of Texas in the spring chasing a paycheck were not searching for adventure. They were doing the hardest work available to someone young, unskilled, and in need of $30. And speaking of who actually worked those trails, the faces riding alongside those teenagers looked nothing like what Hollywood later put on screen. 7. The popular image of the trail boss barking orders from horseback leaves out one of the least glamorous, most essential pieces of equipment on a cattle drive, the chuck wagon. Before Charles Goodnight adapted a surplus army wagon in the late 1860s, food on the trail was whatever you could strap to a pack animal or stash in saddlebags, which meant it spoiled easily and morale went with it. Goodnight took a heavy-duty army freight wagon, reinforced it, and bolted a hinged chuck box to the rear, with drawers and compartments that unfolded into a compact kitchen and pantry. He added a water barrel, tool storage, a flour bin, hooks for Dutch ovens, and space for bedrolls and spare gear. That simple bit of carpentry turned a wagon into a rolling headquarters, a mobile pantry, clinic, repair shop, and social centre all at once. The cook became second only to the trail boss in authority because whoever controlled the food and the coffee controlled the mood of a crew that was cold, wet, sore, and hungry almost all the time. Every evening, when the herd was finally bedded down, it was the circle around the chuck wagon, not the open prairie, that felt like home. And speaking of what actually came out of that kitchen, 8. The food that came off a chuck wagon was not the hearty steak and potatoes feast that Western movies like to imagine. Trail diets were built around ingredients that could survive weeks of jolting in a wagon through heat, dust, and sudden rain without turning poisonous. That meant beans, almost always beans, soaked overnight and boiled for hours, sometimes flavoured with bacon or salt pork if the outfit could afford it. Coffee was the other non-negotiable staple, brewed strong enough to pass for medicine and consumed at every opportunity. Even when it had been reheated so many times, it tasted like burnt mud. Flour became biscuits, sourdough bread and flapjacks when the cook had time and fuel. More often it became simple, dense fare that filled stomachs without offering much variety. Sugar, dried fruit, and molasses were luxuries that appeared rarely. Fresh meat came mainly from the herd itself when an animal broke a leg or became too weak to continue, and even then, the best cuts went to the bosses. Vegetables were nearly non-existent after the first few days out. Cowboys sometimes supplemented their diet by shooting small game or fishing when the schedule allowed, which was not often. The monotony was legendary. Men who rode trails for a few seasons could go the rest of their lives without voluntarily eating a bowl of plain beans again. But there was one more thing the cook provided that mattered as much as the food itself. 9. Nights on the trail were not quiet, peaceful affairs under a calm blanket of stars. They were hours of tension because 1,000 or more half-wild cattle stood between a day of hard work and a night of uninterrupted sleep. To keep the herd from spooking in the dark, cowboys took turns on night guard, circling slowly around the bedded animals in shifting pairs or small groups. One of the tools they used to keep the cattle calm was their own voice. Cowboys sang, softly, repetitively, often off-key. They sang old hymns, folk tunes, nonsense verses, and improvised songs about the trail, the weather, and the girls they claimed were waiting back home. The point wasn't performance, it was sound. A steady human voice told the cattle that nothing was stalking them, that the movement they heard was familiar, that the world hadn't suddenly turned dangerous. Many of the songs were fragments, half remembered from childhood or borrowed from the vaquero tradition, and reshaped in English. Some cowboys whistled or talked to the herd instead, but the effect was similar. The animals learned that a low, continuous murmur in the darkness meant things were under control. Break that pattern with silence followed by a sudden noise, though, and all bets were off. 10. The greatest fear on a cattle drive wasn't running out of coffee or losing the trail. It was a stampede. Cattle that had been pushed hard all day were already on edge, especially if they were longhorns, which combined toughness with a nervousness that bordered on paranoia. A sudden noise, a dropped pan, a gunshot, a coyote yip too close to the herd, could be enough to send hundreds or thousands of animals surging to their feet in blind panic. Thunderstorms magnified the danger, lightning split the sky, thunder rolled and echoed across open plains. Rain turned ground into slick mud, and a single bolt too close to the herd could send the entire mass of animals bolting into the darkness, at speeds no horse could easily match. Cowboys responded by racing to the front and flanks, trying to turn the herd into a wide circle, instead of a straight-line run, shouting and singing at the top of their lungs, sometimes firing guns into the air, not to scare the cattle, but to steer them with sound. Men were crushed under hooves, thrown from horses, tangled in ropes, or disappeared into rivers when stampedes hit water in the dark. The stories of cowboys calmly guiding a roaring herd through a black, lightning-slashed night weren't exaggerations. They were survival accounts. But the biggest change to cattle work in the West had nothing to do with courage in a storm. It came from a simple, viciously efficient invention that reshaped the landscape itself. 11. For a brief window after the Civil War, the open range looked endless, a sea of grass without fences where cattle could graze and move freely across public land. That window slammed shut faster than many ranchers expected, and the mechanism was barbed wire. Patented in the 1870s, barbed wire took a simple idea, a strand of wire with sharp points, twisted along its length, and made fencing cheap enough to enclose miles of land that would have been impossible to wall off with wood in a treeless prairie. Small farmers and large cattle outfits alike began stretching it across the west, claiming pastures, protecting crops, and guarding access to precious water sources. It solved real problems for people trying to establish permanent homes and stop cattle from trampling fields, but it also fractured the old assumption that the range was open to anyone with a herd and the willingness to move it. Traditional trails became choked with fences, routes to waterholes that had been used for generations by indigenous peoples long before cattle ever arrived, were suddenly blocked behind twisted metal designed to tear flesh. The era of long drives that depended on free grass and open access to water became economically and physically harder to sustain. By the 1880s, barbed wire had done quietly what no army ever fully managed. It tamed the plains by dividing them. And those divisions didn't stay peaceful. 12, when strands of barbed wire started slicing across the prairie, not everyone accepted them as legitimate. To a small rancher who had always moved cattle to a particular creek, a fence across that route didn't look like private property, it looked like theft. At the same time, wealthy speculators and large cattle companies sometimes fenced off vast stretches of land they did not legally own, including public domain and school lands, using barbed wire to create de facto empires. The result was a series of conflicts historians group under the broad label fence-cutting wars. Cowboys and small operators rode at night with wire cutters, snipping strands to reopen access to water and grass. Fence owners responded by hiring armed guards, posting threatening notices, and sometimes booby-trapping fences, or patrolling with rifles ready. In Texas, violence grew serious enough in the early 1880s that the state legislature passed strict anti-fence cutting laws and tried to force the removal of illegal enclosures, though enforcement was uneven and often favored those with money and political connections. Some cutters saw themselves as defenders of an older, more communal understanding of the range. Some fence builders insisted they were simply protecting crops, herds, and investments in a chaotic landscape. The conflict wasn't a clean story of good versus bad, so much as a collision between two incompatible visions of land use. By the time it subsided, the open range system was effectively gone, and the West was no longer a place you simply moved across. It was a place increasingly carved into parcels where lines on a map and strands of twisted wire mattered as much as rivers and grass. 13. If barbed wire carved lines across the surface of the plains, windmills quietly transformed what lay underneath. On much of the Great Plains, especially in places far from rivers, there was only one thing standing between a stretch of grass and a usable pasture: access to water buried in underground aquifers. The invention and spread of the steel-bladed, self-regulating windmill in the late 19th century changed that calculation completely. Ranchers could suddenly sink a well in a remote draw and let a wind-driven pump steadily lift water into a stock tank without constant human labour. A patch of land that had been worthless because cattle would die before reaching the nearest stream became valuable grazing overnight. These windmills dotted the horizon, creaking and clanking as they did their work, turning unpredictable rainfall and hidden groundwater into something like a dependable resource. They also shifted power. Whoever could afford to drill and erect enough windmills could claim and hold pasture that otherwise would have stayed part of a shared, loosely used range. The wind that once only battered riders and drove prairie fires became, through gears and blades, a quiet ally in enclosing the West. 14. Once you could pull water out of the ground almost anywhere, the question of who controlled that water became more important than how many acres surrounded it. In cattle country, a single reliable spring or deep well could support herds grazing over miles of open grass, which meant that whoever owned or dominated that point of access effectively controlled the surrounding range regardless of survey lines on a map. This reality produced more than a few bitter disputes. Some fought in courtrooms, many settled with intimidation, hired gunmen, or quiet agreements hammered out in back rooms. Western water law evolved under these pressures, often embracing ideas like prior appropriation, where the first user to put water to beneficial use claimed priority over later users, even if those later users technically held the deed to land downstream. In practice, this meant that an early cattle outfit or irrigation company could secure rights that later settlers found almost impossible to challenge. Stories about the West like to focus on gunfights in dusty streets, but the real long-term power struggles frequently swirled around creeks, ditches, and pump handles. A ranch house might sit on a modest patch of soil, yet its owner could wield enormous influence by controlling the only good water for 20 miles. 15. The animals that made this entire system worthwhile, especially in Texas and the southern plains, were a breed that looked like it had been designed for hardship. Texas Longhorn cattle descended from Spanish stock that had gone feral for generations, adapting to thorny brush, sparse grass, heat, and long periods without easy water. By the time post-Civil War ranchers began driving herds north to railheads in Kansas and beyond, the Longhorn had a reputation for being almost indestructible compared with fatter, shorter-horned eastern breeds. Their sweeping horns helped them defend themselves from predators. Their lean bodies meant they could travel long distances without breaking down. They could survive on rough forage that would starve other cattle. That toughness came with trade-offs. Longhorn beef was often stringier and less marbled, which eastern markets sometimes complained about, and the animals were so spirited that handling them required skilled riders and good horses. But for a world where cattle might have to cross swollen rivers, blizzard-swept plains, and stretches of near-barren range, resilience mattered more than tenderness. The Longhorn wasn't just a symbol of the trail, it was the biological engine that made those risky drives financially possible. 16. Tough as Longhorns were, there was a winter that humbled even them and rewrote the business of ranching almost overnight. The winter of 1886-87 brought a sequence of early blizzards, fierce winds and long, deep freezes across the northern plains and parts of the central west. Cattle that had been left to graze freely on open range, as they had for years, were caught far from shelter or adequate forage. Snow drifted over their usual grazing grounds, ice-locked rivers and creeks, and the animals, already worn thin from overstocked pastures, began to starve and freeze where they stood. Contemporary accounts describe carcasses piled against fence lines, animals frozen in place along riverbanks, and the smell of decay when the thaw finally came. Estimates of losses vary, but many outfits lost half or more of their herds in a single season. Investors back east who had treated cattle as a sure bet suddenly faced ruin. The disaster pushed ranchers toward fenced pastures, stored hay, and more intensive winter feeding, instead of trusting the open range to take care of itself. It also accelerated the shift from vast, loosely managed herds to smaller, more controlled operations. A season of unrelenting cold did what market forces and barbed wire alone had not yet finished. It killed the romantic notion that the plains would endlessly support free-roaming cattle without careful planning. 17. Before refrigerated trucks and interstate highways, getting a steer from the prairie to a city dinner plate required a very specific kind of place, the cow town. Settlements like Abilene, Ellsworth, and later Dodge City grew explosively after railroads pushed their tracks just far enough into cattle country to make trail drives profitable. Ranchers could move herds north along routes like the Chisholm Trail, deliver them to a railhead, and sell to buyers who would load the animals into cars for shipment to slaughterhouses farther east. The towns that grew up around these junctions were part stock market, part shipping terminal, part pressure valve for trail-weary cowboys with pay in their pockets. Saloons, gambling halls, and boarding houses clustered near stock pens and rail yards, feeding on the seasonal flow of money and labour. For a few years, a single decision by a railroad company to extend or reroute a line could make or break a town's fortunes. When tracks pushed farther west or quarantine laws moved the end of the trail, boom towns went quiet almost overnight. The famous stories of lawmen and outlaws in these places usually leave out the fact that the real lifeblood of a cowtown wasn't gun smoke. It was the steady, dusty movement of animals onto trains. 18. Dodge City, which started as a simple trading post near Fort Dodge, turned into one of the best known of those cattle hubs precisely because it learned to make money not just from the herds, but from everything around them. Strategically located near the Arkansas River and the Santa Fe Trail, it became a major shipping point when the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway arrived. The town invested in stockyards where cattle could be gathered, sorted, and held while buyers haggled and railroad schedules shifted. Local businesses sprang up to feed, house, and entertain drovers, railroad workers and buyers. Blacksmiths shod the horses that pushed the herds. Merchants sold gear and clothing. Saloons and dance halls captured wages that might otherwise have walked straight back to Texas. Dodge City's reputation for wildness, gunfighters, cattle barons, and colourful sheriffs, was real enough in moments, but underneath the legends was a carefully organised, profit-driven system for handling massive flows of livestock. The town thrived as long as it sat at the right point in that network. When routes and rail priorities changed, its days as the queen of the cowtowns waned, leaving behind a mythology far larger than the years when cattle actually ruled its streets. 19. For all the posters and movies that turned frontier streets into non-stop battlefields, many of the most famous western towns actually spent a lot of effort trying to stop people from walking around armed. In places like Dodge City, Wichita, and Deadwood, local ordinances often required visitors to check their guns with the sheriff, or at certain businesses when they rode into town. The goal wasn't to disarm everyone out of principle, it was to keep drunken arguments and gambling disputes from escalating into full-on bloodbaths every Saturday night. Merchants, railroad agents, and cattle buyers wanted a place where commerce could function without constant fear of stray bullets. Newspapers sometimes printed notices reminding newcomers that carrying a revolver inside town limits could mean a fine, confiscation, or a night in jail. Western boosters later helped erase these rules from memory because they clashed with the image of rugged individualists, forever bristling with weapons. The quieter reality was that a lot of people in the West, especially those with property and businesses at stake, preferred streets where tempers cooled before someone reached for a holster. 20. Bartholomew Bat Masterson's life looked less like a straight line and more like a card game where the dealer kept changing the rules. He started as a buffalo hunter on the plains, then drifted into Dodge City at the height of its cattle boom, taking on roles as a deputy, sheriff, and occasional town marshal when local leaders needed someone who understood both guns and gamblers. At the same time, he made money at the faro and poker tables, proving that for some frontier figures, gambling wasn't a vice so much as a parallel career. When law work grew tiresome or politically dangerous, he moved on to Denver to Kansas City, eventually to New York, chasing opportunities in prize-fighting promotion, saloon ownership, and finally journalism. By the early 20th century, Masterson was writing a sports column and reminiscing about gunfights for an Eastern newspaper audience that adored tales of the old days. His story undercuts the notion that Western lawmen were fixed, upright guardians, separated from gamblers and hustlers. In reality, one man could drift in and out of those categories depending on who was paying, what the town needed, and how the political winds happened to blow. 21. Before anyone heard the name Tombstone or the phrase OK, Corral, Wyatt Earp had already lived what most people would have considered a full, complicated frontier life. He tried his hand as a teamster and farm labourer in the Midwest, worked briefly as a lawman in places like Wichita and Dodge City, and just as often found himself on the other side of the badge, arrested for things like horse theft or operating without proper licenses. He drifted between roles as a deputy, saloon keeper, faro dealer, and sometime buffalo hunter, following the same boom and bust pattern that pulled thousands of anonymous men across the plains. His brothers and associates did the same, forming loose networks that could present themselves as respectable law and order coalitions in one town, and partners in gambling ventures in the next. When he finally arrived in Tombstone in 1879, he was not a blank slate hero riding in to clean up a lawless camp. He was a seasoned operator who understood that enforcing ordinances, protecting business interests, and running games of chance were all part of the same economic ecosystem. The famous gunfight that later defined his legend was just one episode in a long career of improvisation. 22. The shootout that turned Tombstone into a permanent fixture in Western memory unfolded so briefly that, if you had blinked at the wrong moment, you might have missed it. On October 26, 1881, tensions that had simmered for months between the Earps, their ally Doc Holliday, and members of the so-called cowboy faction finally boiled over in a cramped lot near a livery and some outbuildings not actually inside the OK corral itself. Witnesses later described about 30 seconds of shouting, muzzle flashes and confusion, with somewhere around 30 shots fired in that half-minute. When the smoke cleared, 3 cowboys lay dead or dying, and several of the lawmen were wounded. The town then spent far more time dealing with the legal and political aftermath, coroners' inquests, hearings, editorials, partisan speeches than it had on the violence itself. Novelists, dime magazines, and later filmmakers stretched those few seconds into elaborate set pieces, inserting dramatic dialogues and slow showdowns that never happened. The real event looked less like 2 tidy lines of men politely facing off, and more like a messy, close-quarters burst of fear and gunpowder in a narrow space crowded with onlookers. 23. Tombstone rose in the Sonoran Desert, not because anyone thought it would make a pleasant place to live, but because silver pulled people toward it like a magnet. Rich ore deposits discovered in the late 1870s attracted prospectors first, then outside investors who poured money into mines, hoisting works, stamp mills, and the maze of tunnels that quickly honeycombed the hills. Within a few years the camp had streets, brick buildings, an opera house, and gas lamps, amenities designed to convince Eastern capital that this was a serious, stable city rather than a fly-by-night diggings. Every saloon, boarding house, and general store that lined Allen Street existed because the silver payrolls needed a place to flow. The mines demanded wood, machinery, skilled engineers, labourers willing to work underground in dangerous conditions, and lawyers to argue over claims in court. When water seeped into deep shafts and ore prices shifted, the very thing that had made Tombstone boom threatened to undo it. By the time its most famous gunfight was being mythologized back east, the town's economic foundation was already beginning to crumble. Underneath the legends of card games and shootouts lay an industrial operation whose fortunes rose and fell with global metal markets and the stubborn problem of flooding tunnels. 24. Deadwood's origin story fits the pattern of many frontier gold camps, but with an added layer of legal and political complexity that often gets glossed over. The town sprang up in the mid-1870s after prospectors rushed into the Black Hills region, land that had been guaranteed to the Lakota people by treaty, but was suddenly swarmed when reports of gold leaked out. Miners, merchants, gamblers, and camp followers threw together tents, shacks, and rough streets in a narrow gulch, creating a bustling settlement that on paper shouldn't have existed at all under existing agreements. For a time, Deadwood operated in a kind of grey zone with miners' courts, ad hoc committees, and makeshift regulations trying to fill the vacuum left by absent federal authority. Claims were staked, fortunes were made and lost, and violence flared without the framework of fully recognized territorial law. Only later, as the United States pushed to formalize control over the region and folded it into the broader structure of Dakota Territory, did Deadwood move from being an essentially illegal encampment to a town with charters, elected officials, and official courts. By then, its early years of contested legitimacy had already been repackaged into stories about colourful outlaws and poker games, leaving the underlying story of broken treaties and improvised governance largely in the background. 25. Wild Bill Hickok's last evening in Deadwood has been retold so many times that it's hard to separate memory from performance. On August 2, 1876, he walked into Nuttall and Mann's saloon to play cards, reportedly uneasy about sitting with his back to the room and asking to trade seats, a request that was brushed off or ignored, depending on which version you read. A drifter named Jack McCall stepped in behind him and fired a revolver, killing Hickok before he could draw. Later accounts insisted that the cards in Hickok's hand at the moment of his death were 2 black aces and 2 black eights, plus an unknown 5th card, the combination that became famous as the dead man's hand. Contemporary sources barely mention the exact cards, and some historians argue the hand was assigned years later by writers eager for symbolism. What is clear is that gamblers and storytellers embrace the image of a legendary gunfighter slumped over a bad luck hand, turning one more violent saloon, killing into a piece of folklore that still lingers at modern poker tables. 26. Calamity Jane built a public image in the West that was part autobiography, part rumour mill, and part deliberate marketing campaign. Born Martha Canary, she drifted through frontier jobs, camp follower, laundress, occasional scout, while claiming much grander exploits, including daring rides for the army and life-saving rescues that official records don't always support. She dressed in buckskins, swore freely, and drank heavily, behaviour that fascinated reporters who were hunting for colourful characters to fill columns back east. Jane willingly gave interviews and told stories that blurred the line between what she had actually done and what audiences wanted to hear, sometimes expanding her connections to figures like Wild Bill Hickok in ways that later historians view as unlikely. Dime novelists then took her persona and exaggerated it even further, turning her into a crackshot and fearless scout who rode beside army columns and tamed the wilderness. By the time she was appearing in Wild West shows and posing for photographs, Calamity Jane had become a living legend, half made by her own tongue, and half shaped by a culture that loved the idea of a rough-edged, gun-toting frontier woman, whether or not the details added up. 27. William Buffalo Bill Cody understood earlier than most that the West could be packaged, rehearsed, and sold like any other entertainment. He had real experience as a buffalo hunter, scout, and rider, work that intersected with army campaigns, railroad expansion, and government contracts in ways that were less glamorous than later posters suggested. In the 1880s, he transformed those experiences into Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a travelling show that stitched together staged buffalo hunts, reenactments of battles, trick riding, and marksmanship displays into a kind of live-action postcard. The show toured not only across the United States, but throughout Europe, drawing crowds who had never seen the plains yet left feeling as if they'd witnessed the frontier firsthand. Cody's scripts and casting choices tended to simplify conflicts, casting cowboys, scouts, and soldiers as heroic civilizers while presenting Native Americans as noble but defeated adversaries or symbolic allies. For many spectators, his version of the West became the version, collapsing diverse cultures, messy politics, and brutal wars into a 2-hour spectacle. The wildness on display was tightly choreographed, but its emotional impact helped fix a romantic, action-packed West in the global imagination for generations. 28. Annie Oakley stepped into Buffalo Bill's arena and quietly rearranged what people thought frontier skill and respectability could look like. Born Phoebe Ann Moses, she developed extraordinary marksmanship hunting game as a child, then moved into professional shooting at a time when the idea of a female sharpshooter struck many as a novelty act. In Cody's Wild West, she systematically demolished that expectation, hitting thrown glass balls, splitting playing cards on edge, and reportedly shooting the ashes off a cigarette held by her husband, routines that became crowd favourites. Newspapers marvelled at her accuracy, but also at her modest clothing and self-presentation, which reassured audiences that a woman could be both deadly with a rifle and conventionally proper. Oakley's fame spread across the Atlantic. Royalty attended her shows, and stories circulated, some confirmed, some likely embellished, about her outshooting famous male marksmen. Her success highlighted how much the mythic West depended on performance, publicity, and carefully managed personas. While dime novels and paintings offered static images, Annie Oakley's live demonstrations convinced millions that they had seen the real frontier in action, even though they were watching a scripted routine under canvas. 29. The Pony Express gallops through Western lore as a symbol of unstoppable riders racing across endless plains, but the company itself barely survived a year. Launched in April 1860 by the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, it relied on a relay system of riders and horses moving mail between Missouri and California in about 10 days, an impressive speed for the era. Stations dotted the route every few miles, with riders changing mounts quickly and occasionally riding through storms, rough country, and the possibility of attacks. The service was expensive, heavily subsidized, and always intended as a stopgap, while more permanent communication infrastructure crept westward. When the transcontinental telegraph was completed in October 1861, it rendered the Pony Express largely obsolete almost overnight, allowing messages to flash between coasts far faster and cheaper than any horse. The company folded, its assets sold off, and many of its riders moved into other frontier jobs or Civil War service. Later, writers and filmmakers inflated those 18 months into a saga of rugged heroism, turning what was effectively a short-lived corporate experiment into one of the most enduring symbols of frontier endurance. 30. Long before highways and roadside motels, stagecoach stations stitched together the West, functioning as tiny fragile outposts of stability in vast stretches of uncertainty. Companies like Wells Fargo and the Butterfield Overland Mail set up relay points every dozen miles or so, places where drivers could swap tired teams for fresh horses, pick up mail, and sometimes grab a quick meal or a few minutes of rest. Some stations were little more than crude adobe buildings or log structures with a corral manned by a handful of employees who coped with isolation, harsh weather, and the threat of robbery or conflict. Others grew into small clusters of buildings with blacksmiths, trading posts, and basic lodging, seeds that occasionally developed into full-fledged towns when railroads or trails shifted their routes. For passengers enduring days or weeks of jolting travel over rutted roads, these stops were psychological lifelines as much as logistical ones. Brief chances to stretch, hear news and see other faces. Telegraph lines sometimes ran alongside stage routes, turning stations into communication nodes where military dispatches, commercial orders, and personal messages could be sent or received. In the quieter historical record, these modest waypoints did more than dramatic gunfights to knit distant settlements into a connected, if still precarious, frontier world. 31. The Overland Mail network looks quaint next to airplanes and fibre optics, but in its day it rewrote the map of connection. Before regular lines were established, letters might take months to stumble across the continent, bounced from ship to wagon to chance courier, with long, anxious silences in between. Companies operating stage lines, freight routes, and later combined coach and mail services created predictable schedules, however rough. A coach leaving St. Louis on a certain day could reasonably be expected in Santa Fe or San Francisco within a known window. Isolated settlers learned to time their hopes to those schedules, counting the days until a coach or rider might appear on the horizon, with news from back east. Contracts from the federal government turned those routes into an early communication backbone, with private operators racing to secure lucrative mail bids and then improvising routes through deserts, mountain passes, and territories only loosely mapped. Way stations and depots doubled as informal post offices, places where someone might collect a packet of letters, a newspaper weeks old, or a single folded sheet that carried births, deaths, and business decisions. The network wasn't smooth or universally reliable. Routes shifted with politics, weather, and violence, and some deliveries never arrived at all. Yet by giving frontier communities something resembling a regular pulse of information, overland mail helped turn scattered outposts into participants in a shared, if still distant, national conversation. 32. When telegraph poles began marching across the plains, they brought a kind of invisible storm front that permanently changed how distance felt. Instead of waiting days for a stagecoach letter, a merchant in Denver could receive a telegram from New York in minutes, written in clipped phrases that carried contracts, commodity prices, or urgent family news. The transcontinental telegraph line, completed in 1861, made older systems like the Pony Express instantly obsolete, even though the wooden poles and humming wires looked fragile against the sky. Military commanders quickly recognized the power of near-instant communication, using telegraph stations at frontier forts to coordinate troop movements and report on conflicts that might previously have gone unnoticed for weeks. Newspapers in tiny western towns could suddenly publish headlines about elections, wars, and market panics, almost as they happened, knitting readers into a rolling national narrative instead of a delayed echo. Ranchers, miners, and railroad agents gathered at offices to send or receive terse messages, paying by the word and composing sentences that were more code than conversation. The system depended on teams of linemen who repaired wind damage, lightning strikes, and vandalism, sometimes under threat from people who viewed the poles as symbols of unwanted change. Even so, the telegraph's basic promise, turning geography into a technical challenge instead of an absolute barrier, set the stage for every later communication technology that would compress the West into something you could navigate with a clock and a map. 33. Before railroads forced the issue, time in the West was a local, subjective thing, anchored to whatever moment the sun stood highest overhead. A town might set its clocks by a courthouse sundial, or the judgment of a respected resident, while the next settlement down the line, 20 miles away, might be several minutes behind or ahead, without anyone worrying about it. That easy flexibility collapsed as railroads pushed across the continent, trying to run trains on timetables that depended on precisely knowing when one train would reach a junction and another would depart. Railroad companies found themselves juggling dozens of local times, a logistical mess that increased the risk of collisions when engineers misunderstood which noon their orders referenced. To solve the problem, railroad associations divided the continent into standardized time zones in the 1880s, and on a chosen November day, many companies simply switched their clocks and schedules to the new system. Some towns grumbled or staged symbolic resistance, insisting on keeping God's time, while also quietly adjusting station clocks so passengers could catch their trains. Over time, the railroad timetable won. Businesses, schools, and governments aligned their days to the standardized hours because it made commerce and travel simpler. The shift changed more than scheduling. It subtly reoriented people's sense of where they lived, placing them within an invisible grid that stretched from coast to coast. What looked like a dry technical fix was, in practice, another way the railroad wrote its priorities onto daily life in the West. 34. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is often told with iron, steam, and famous financiers at the centre, but thousands of anonymous Chinese labourers laid much of the actual track. Recruited from southern China and from Chinese communities already living on the west coast, they joined work crews that blasted through the Sierra Nevada, filled ravines, and carved ledges into sheer granite cliffs. Company officials initially doubted their stamina, then quietly increased their numbers when it became clear they worked efficiently in conditions that drove other workers away. The pay was lower than that offered to many white labourers, and Chinese crews typically provided their own food and supplies, living in segregated camps that followed the construction line like shadows. Avalanches, explosions, and collapses killed unknown numbers. Their deaths often recorded, if at all, in sparse company notes rather than personal obituaries. When tracks met at Promontory Summit in 1869, the iconic photographs celebrated executives, politicians, and a few chosen workers, while Chinese crews who had done so much of the most dangerous work remained largely outside the frame. After the line was finished, many former railroad workers scattered into other Western occupations, laundries, small farms, mining camps, only to encounter increasing legal restrictions and violence, fueled by anti-Chinese sentiment. Their labour had helped knit the country together, but the official narrative for decades treated them as background detail rather than central builders of the Western infrastructure. 35. As the rails moved west, they dragged clusters of tents, shacks, and hastily built saloons behind them, settlements nicknamed Hell on Wheels for good reason. These mobile towns existed mainly to service the paydays of track-laying crews, offering gambling, alcohol, sex, and supplies in proportions that often outpaced any formal law. A camp might spring up almost overnight at the railroad's temporary terminus, filling with merchants, entertainers, swindlers, and people chasing the brief, chaotic economy that followed workers' wages. Violence was common, from barroom brawls to more calculated robberies, and makeshift jails or vigilante committees tried, with mixed success, to impose order. Clergy and temperance advocates sometimes arrived soon after, setting up tents or crude chapels in the midst of the noise, hoping to civilize the atmosphere before the railroad moved on. When the line pushed farther, many structures were literally loaded onto wagons and pulled along the route, leaving behind a skeletal remnant or nothing at all. A few hell-on-wheels sites eventually stabilized into permanent towns, once stations, depots, and nearby homesteads made them useful beyond the construction boom. Others vanished so completely that only scattered artifacts or mentions in diaries and payroll records mark where they briefly burned hot along the advancing track. In the cultural memory of the West, they became shorthand for the railroad's rough, improvised human edge, a world of opportunity and risk that flickered in and out with the progress of steel. 36 Western boomtowns could appear with startling speed, swelling from a handful of tents into crowded streets as news of a strike or opportunity spread. A gold discovery in a mountain gulch, a promising silver vein, or even the rumour of a major railroad depot could pull in prospectors, shopkeepers, gamblers and families within weeks. Hastily built storefronts and boarding houses lined muddy, rutted streets, while makeshift governments tried to set rules for claims, business licenses and basic order. Land prices soared, with speculators buying and selling lots on the expectation that this would be the next Denver, Leadville or Virginia City. But geology and corporate decisions were indifferent to local hopes. When ore veins pinched out, water ran short, or a railroad chose a different route, the economic heart of a boomtown could fail abruptly. People who had arrived dreaming of fortune often left just as quickly, packing what they could and abandoning buildings that were too flimsy or worthless to move. Some former boomtowns dwindled into quiet hamlets, their populations stabilizing around ranching or modest local trade. Others collapsed entirely, leaving false fronts, rusting equipment, and tilted grave markers as the last evidence of their brief moment of crowded importance. These ghost towns dot the historical West as reminders that for all the talk of rugged individualism, many lives were shaped by forces, market shifts, company strategies, mineral luck that could flip prosperity to emptiness almost overnight. 37. In much of the arid West, when a boom town died, the desert simply refused to finish the job. Low humidity slowed rot and mould, so wood-framed houses, false-fronted stores, and boardwalks lingered for decades, their paint bleaching rather than peeling away into mush. Roof shingles curled but didn't collapse as quickly, and adobe walls dried into hard shells that could stand long after human footsteps faded. Wind and sun did their quiet work, sanding signs unreadable and loosening nails, yet compared to wetter climates, decay moved in slow motion. The same dryness that made life hard for settlers accidentally became an archivist, preserving their abandoned experiments in community. 38. The Comstock lode in Nevada forced miners to learn how to chase wealth downward into unforgiving rock, instead of just sideways along the surface. Rich silver ore beckoned from depths where heat, groundwater, and unstable ground combined into a kind of industrialized hell, collapsing traditional shallow shaft technique. To keep tunnels from crushing workers, engineers developed elaborate timbering systems like the square set method, building latticed wooden cubes that shored up caverns as they advanced. Huge pumps wrestled with scalding water that poured into the workings, while ventilation systems struggled to dilute dust and poisonous gases. Costs soared, and only well-capitalized companies could afford the machinery, crews, and constant repairs demanded by this kind of deep extraction. 39. In the Sierra foothills of California, some miners stopped sifting creek gravel by hand and turned whole hillsides into targets. Hydraulic mining rigs used iron nozzles called monitors to focus enormous jets of high-pressure water that blasted away soil and rock with startling efficiency. Slurries of mud raced through sluices to trap gold, while the stripped hills above slumped into raw, treeless scars that eroded with every storm. Downstream, rivers choked with debris, navigation channels filled, and fertile farm valleys were buried under layers of gravel and silt. Lawsuits from angry farmers eventually forced courts to limit hydraulic mining, marking one of the earliest major environmental battles in the American West. 40. The romance of the prospector usually starts with a single person crouched by a stream, swirling a pan through cold water. That simple placer method, washing loose gravel, so the heavier gold settled at the bottom, required little more than a pan, patience and luck, making it accessible to people with almost no capital. As easy pickings dwindled, many graduated to rocker boxes and long toms, wooden contraptions that processed more dirt with less back-breaking repetition. Sluice boxes extended the principle even further, channeling water over riffles that trapped gold, while lighter material washed away. By then, success often depended on having partners, lumber, water rights, and maybe a claim near someone wealthy's ditch, reminding everyone that even individual mining quickly brushed up against larger systems. 41. To coax tiny gold particles out of sand and crushed ore, Western miners turned to a liquid metal with a deceptive shine. Mercury, or quicksilver, eagerly formed amalgams with gold, so miners poured or brushed it over riffles, copper plates, or piles of concentrate, then heated the mixture later to vaporize the mercury and leave the gold behind. It felt like a clever shortcut, a way to catch flecks too small to see, especially in sprawling placer operations and stamp mills. The invisible cost was that spilled mercury seeped into riverbeds, floodplains, and marshes, where it persisted and slowly transformed into more toxic forms. Long after the last campfire went cold, fish, wildlife, and downstream communities inherited contamination from decisions made in the rush for metal. 42. In many remote mining and lumber camps, a worker's paycheck came not in dollars but in a closed-loop promise. Companies issued scrip, tokens, paper notes, or metal checks that could technically represent wages but were usually redeemable only at the employer's own store, where prices didn't have to compete with anyone else's. On paper, the system solved logistical headaches, letting firms operate in isolated regions without hauling large amounts of cash or relying on distant banks. In practice, it often tied workers to a single economic ecosystem where rent, food, and tools all flowed back into company ledgers, even when laws or organizing efforts chipped away at the practice. The memory of being paid in something you couldn't freely spend lingered as another reminder of how power shaped daily life in the West. 43. In towns scattered across the plains and mountain valleys, the saloon functioned less like a movie bar and more like a rotating city hall and stock exchange combined. Cattle buyers, freighters, and mine investors met at sticky tables, spreading maps and tally books beside their glasses while they haggled over herds, freight rates, and ore samples. Ranch hands picked up wages, then immediately spent part of them on tools or clothes arranged through local merchants who used the saloon as a contact point. Travelling lawyers, land agents, and railroad representatives posted notices, exchanged contracts, and used the back rooms for quick arbitrations that settled disputes before they reached distant courts. Even the mail might pass through, with letters and parcels tacked behind the bar or stacked in corners, waiting for riders who treated the place as an unofficial post office. 44. For gamblers and spectators in frontier saloons, the main attraction often wasn't poker's slow, thoughtful rhythm, but a faster, flashier game called faro. A green cloth layout, a dealing box, and a deck of cards turned a corner table into a magnet for cowboys, clerks, and drifters who crowded close, placing chips on squares that matched the cards they hoped would turn up. The game moved quickly, bets laid down, card drawn, money swept up or paid out in a continual, almost hypnotic flow that promised instant reversals of fortune. Because the odds were relatively good compared to other games, players felt they had a real shot, while the house relied on subtle edges and, in some cases, outright crooked dealing. Stories of gunfights over rigged faro tables travelled almost as widely as the game itself, cementing its reputation as the real gambling heartbeat of many Western towns. 45. In raw, male-heavy frontier settlements, where women were vastly outnumbered, dance halls emerged as both escape valves and improvised social laboratories. Proprietors converted rough wooden buildings into long rooms with a musician in the corner, a bar along one wall, and a floor where miners, cowboys, and clerks paid for the privilege of a few minutes' waltz or schottische with a hired dance hall girl. Women working there navigated a complicated space between entertainment and survival, earning money through dance tickets, drinks, conversation, and sometimes relationships that blurred lines between romance, companionship, and commerce. For many men, a night at the hall meant borrowing manners they rarely used elsewhere, following rules about waiting turns, avoiding fights, and respecting the house. In communities that might otherwise have revolved entirely around work and drinking, these halls created temporary rituals of civility, flirtation, and human contact that softened the edges of isolation. 46. Even in mining camps balanced on mountain ledges or cattle towns days from the nearest major city, people hungered for more than card games and whiskey, so travelling theatre troupes followed the trails of money and loneliness. Performers carted trunks of costumes, battered props, and dog-eared scripts, ready to turn a crude hall, barn, or upstairs room into a makeshift stage for an evening. One night might feature a cut-down Shakespeare play with hammy sword fights and improvised dialogue to fit the audience's mood. The next could be sentimental melodrama, comic sketches, or popular songs that everyone half knew from sheet music. Audiences who spent their days in mud, dust, or dimly lit shafts cleaned up as best they could, crammed onto benches, and shouted, laughed, or wept with a fervour that astonished visiting actors. For a few hours, the town was not a remote outpost, but a participant in a shared cultural world stretching back to London, New York, and beyond. 47. Long before radio, or reliable long-distance telephones, even tiny frontier settlements often insisted on having a newspaper, sometimes run by a single overworked editor with an aging press. The weekly, or whenever the press could be fixed issues, mixed boosterish articles promising that the town was destined to become the next great metropolis, with lists of arriving trains, missing cattle, church events, and who had hosted last Sunday's supper. Political editorials thundered against rivals in neighbouring towns or distant capitals, turning local papers into battlegrounds where national debates about tariffs, railroads, and land policy became sudden, personal matters. Anonymous letters and pointed notices aired grudges, romantic rumours, and business conflicts in language just polite enough to avoid libel, but sharp enough that everyone knew who was meant. Between the lines, readers could track hopes, fears, and alliances in places that might otherwise leave almost no written trace of how they saw themselves. 48. While newspapers tried to describe the West as it was, another kind of cheap print product busily reinvented it into something far more dramatic and marketable. Dime novels, thin booklets sold at newsstands and general stores for small coins, poured out lurid tales of lone gunfighters, noble scouts, savage outlaws, and stoic lawmen locked in endless showdowns. Real figures like Buffalo Bill, Wild Bill Hickok, and Calamity Jane appeared in wildly embroidered adventures that bore only a loose relationship to anything they had actually done, if they had done it at all. Readers back east and in Europe devoured these stories, forming mental pictures of the frontier that exaggerated violence, simplified cultures, and glossed over the tedious work and crowded multicultural reality of many Western communities. Over time, the myths fed back into the region itself, as locals leaned into the legend for tourism and self-image, blurring the boundary between the historical West and the one that still rides through popular memory. 49. Photographers arrived in frontier towns, not just as documentarians, but as quiet stage managers, choosing what would stand for reality and what could be left outside the frame. A main street choked with mud, wandering pigs, and collapsed sheds became, with a few adjustments, a dignified avenue of progress. Wagons shifted out of sight, broken fences cropped away, subjects instructed to stand stone, still in their best clothes, while the shutter slowly opened and closed. In some cases, scenes of Indian attacks, posse chases, or heroic last stands were staged outright with cooperative locals in borrowed costumes, posed corpses, or artfully arranged props. Even when no one was faking a shootout, choices about angle, backdrop, and who got included in a group portrait created a subtle filter. Chinese labourers, black cowboys, indigenous families, and women doing heavy work might be present in town but absent in the album, making the West appear whiter, cleaner, and more orderly than anyone actually living there would have recognised. Those carefully curated images travelled back east and across the ocean, fixing the idea that the frontier was a land of rugged individualists and tidy progress, rather than a messy, crowded, and often precarious place stitched together by many hands. 50. Among the most democratic technologies to reach the frontier was the tintype, a simple process that put portraits within reach of almost anyone with a few spare coins. Instead of fragile glass plates or expensive studio sessions, a photographer could coat a thin sheet of iron, expose it while the sitter held their breath, then develop the image in a few minutes, handing over a small silvery rectangle that would outlast many of its owners. Miners in patched shirts, soldiers between campaigns, cowboys before trail drives, and families pausing on their way to new homesteads, all crowded into makeshift studios made from tents, wagons, or rented back rooms. People brought their best or only hat, a borrowed rifle, a fiddle, or even a baby chick, using props to say something about who they were or who they hoped to become. Lovers exchanged tintypes before long separations. Parents mailed them to relatives back east who might never see the growing children in person. Because the images were direct positives, no negatives required, each one was unique, a single fragile proof that a particular person had stood in that particular spot on the edge of what they believed was a new world. Today, those small, dark, sometimes scratched plates are among the most intimate sources we have for frontier faces, preserving traces of pride, exhaustion, bravado, and homesickness that diaries and newspapers rarely captured. 51. Romantic posters and railroad pamphlets made homesteading look like simple arithmetic. File a claim, plough the soil, watch prosperity grow. The actual math was punishing. A family might gain 160 acres on paper, but face the reality that much of it was thin, dry, or stony, demanding more labour and equipment than they could afford. To keep the land, they had to prove up by building a dwelling, breaking a certain number of acres, and living on site for years, all while weather, illness, and market prices swung unpredictably. Droughts could turn fields to dust. Too much rain could rot crops or wash away topsoil. A single hailstorm or an early frost might erase an entire year's work overnight, leaving debts on tools, seed, and transportation still due. Isolation added another invisible cost: hours to the nearest town, limited medical help, long winters with few neighbours, and intense pressure on marriages and family dynamics. Many homesteaders quietly abandoned their claims, selling what little they could or merely slipping away, while others survived only by taking seasonal work on railroads, in mines, or for nearby ranches. The success stories that did emerge often required a combination of luck, cooperative neighbours, outside income, and sheer endurance, making the advertised dream far more complicated than the brochures ever admitted. 52. On the open prairies and high plains, a basic problem confronted new arrivals almost immediately: there simply weren't enough trees to build the kinds of houses they knew. Instead of neat log cabins, many families learned to carve their walls straight out of the land itself, cutting thick, root-laced slabs of prairie sod and stacking them like giant bricks to form sod houses or soddies. The process was grueling and precise. The best sod had deep, intertwined roots that held each block together, and cutting straight lines for hours with a breaking plough or spade was exhausting work. Inside, these homes were cooler in summer, warmer in winter, and surprisingly quiet, their thick walls muffling wind that howled outside. But they also shed dust and little clods onto tables, beds, and anyone unlucky enough to sit under a weak patch of ceiling. When it rained, the smell of damp earth filled the rooms, and insects or small animals sometimes found their way into the walls, reminding occupants that their shelter was literally alive. Families did what they could to soften the roughness, plastering walls, adding scraps of lumber, hanging newspapers or cloth as decoration and insulation. For visitors used to clapboard houses or city brick, sod homes looked like temporary holes in the ground. But for thousands of homesteaders, they were the first, and sometimes only, line of defence against weather that could otherwise drive them straight back east. 53. For settlers living on grasslands that stretched past the horizon, fire was not just a camp tool or cooking method, but an ever-present communal nightmare. Dry seasons could turn waist-high prairie grasses into tinder, waiting for one careless match, lightning strike or spark from a locomotive wheel to erupt into a wall of flame racing faster than a galloping horse. From a distance, a wildfire might appear as a low, rolling cloud, but as it approached, heat, smoke, and a roaring sound like a distant freight train announced that there was little time to act. People ploughed emergency fire breaks, beat at edges with wet sacks, or burned narrow strips of land in advance, hoping to rob the larger fire of fuel before it reached their homes, haystacks, corrals, and livestock. Children were drilled on where to run, often to ploughed fields or already burned ground, and what precious items, if any, to grab on the way out. Some families survived by sheltering in wells or root cellars, while others watched everything they owned vanish in an afternoon, their savings transformed into ash and twisted metal. Indigenous nations had long used controlled burns to manage grasslands and reduce dangerous build-up. But many newcomers ignored or suppressed those practices, learning only through bitter experience how quickly the prairie could punish carelessness or bad luck. 54. As if drought, hail, and fire weren't enough, homesteaders across parts of the Great Plains and Midwest periodically faced an onslaught that seemed almost biblical. Swarms of locusts, most infamously the Rocky Mountain locust in the 1870s, descended in such dense clouds that witnesses said they darkened the sky, clinging to clothes, fences, and buildings in a living curtain. Within hours they could strip fields bare, chewing not only wheat and corn but garden vegetables, fruit trees, fence posts, harness leather, and even the wool right off live sheep, leaving farms that had looked promising in the morning completely devastated by evening. Newspapers printed accounts of children weeping as carefully tended crops disappeared, of mothers brushing insects from babies' faces while trying to cook with grain the pests hadn't yet contaminated. Some families tried covering their fields with sheets, banging pots, or digging trenches, but the scale of certain swarms made most defences feel laughably small. The financial and emotional shock pushed already struggling households into crisis. Debts came due with no harvest to sell, and promises made to relatives back east about rich land and easy prosperity started to sound hollow. Interestingly, the Rocky Mountain locust later vanished so completely that scientists still debate exactly how and why the species went extinct, leaving behind only preserved specimens, government reports, and the memories of those who watched their futures eaten alive. 55. Long before Amazon trucks rumbled down cul-de-sacs, the frontier version of click and ship arrived in the form of mail-order catalogues thick enough to press flowers in. Railroads stitched remote prairie towns, mining camps, and ranch outposts into a national web, and companies like Montgomery Ward and, a little later, Sears learnt that a printed book of promises could travel wherever the tracks did. A family living days from the nearest substantial town could flip through page after page of stoves, rocking chairs, boots, rifles, sewing machines, dishes, and even entire house kits, each item carefully illustrated and described as if the buyer were standing in a gleaming city showroom. Orders went out via post or telegraph. The money followed, and weeks later crates appeared at lonely depots, a cast-iron cook stove that made winter slightly less brutal, a parlour organ that turned a sod house into something that felt like a home, or bundles of pre-cut lumber that, when assembled, became a neat, standardised cottage in the middle of nowhere. Prices were often lower than what local merchants could offer, which created friction. Storekeepers grumbled about being undercut by distant firms, while farmers quietly circled catalogue pages in pencil and budgeted for the next harvest. These catalogues doubled as wish books and cultural bridges, showing rural families the latest urban fashions and gadgets, planting ideas about what a modern American household should look like. In an era when travel was expensive and time-consuming, the ability to summon a piece of Chicago, St. Louis, or Kansas City to your doorstep made even the most isolated homestead feel a little less cut off from the wider world. 56. For all the glossy temptations arriving by rail, day-to-day survival, for many frontier families still hinged on the local general store, a crowded, creaking place where barrels of flour, kegs of nails, bolts of calico, and jars of candy shared space on the same rough plank floor. Cash was scarce and harvests were uncertain, so storekeepers commonly extended credit, jotting purchases in long, careful columns under each family's name, with the understanding that debts would be settled after the crops came in or cattle were sold. In good years, that system smoothed over the lean months. In bad years, it turned the ledger into a quiet instrument of control. A failed wheat crop, a blizzard that killed half the herd, or a sudden drop in commodity prices might mean a bill that could never fully be paid. Some merchants were patient neighbours willing to carry balances for years. Others tightened terms, demanded collateral, or quietly favoured certain customers over others, deepening social divides in tiny communities where everyone knew everyone. Families juggled which debts to pay first, maybe skimping on sugar or lamp oil to keep from losing a wagon or a piece of land pledged against the account. The store became a kind of informal bank, news centre, and social barometer all at once. Who got credit and who did not said as much about local power as who owned the biggest ranch. While the mythic West celebrates independence and self-reliance, many households found their fates bound to a few ink lines in a merchant's book, living in a constant tension between the freedom of open land and the invisible chains of seasonal debt. 57. On many stretches of the frontier, the first public building to appear after a few scattered cabins was not a jail, a bank, or even a church, but a one-room schoolhouse planted on a patch of donated land. Rough on the outside and often drafty in winter, these simple structures did far more work than their school label suggested, serving as classroom by day and almost everything else by night and weekend. Children of mixed ages crowded onto benches to recite lessons, trace letters on slates, and take turns reading from the same few books, while a single teacher, sometimes barely older than the oldest pupils, tried to keep order and ambition alive. After hours, desks might be pushed aside to make room for church services led by itinerant preachers, town meetings where road routes and fence laws were argued, travelling lectures and temperance rallies, quilting bees, barn dance, fiddlers, tuning up, or makeshift court sessions settling land disputes. On election days, these buildings turned into polling places, bringing men and, in some territories, women in from distant homesteads to cast ballots and trade news. The schoolhouse stove warmed more than just students. It warmed a sense of shared identity on landscapes where neighbours might be miles apart and winter could make visits rare. For children who started life in dugouts or soddies, the school offered a glimpse of a broader world through maps on the wall, stories read aloud, and the simple fact of gathering with others their age. In a region often remembered for saloons and gunfights, these plain rooms, smelling of chalk, coal smoke, and damp wool, quietly stitched together civic life, one spelling bee and town meeting at a time. 58. In the boom and bust rhythm of mining camps, cattle towns, and railroad junctions, stability was rare and formal employment for women even rarer, which made boarding houses one of the few enterprises where a woman could exercise real economic clout. A determined widow or wife might rent or build a modest house, then cram it with as many beds, cots, and straw mattresses as she could reasonably supervise, turning every spare corner into rentable space for single men who needed a place to sleep, eat, and store what few belongings they carried. Boarders might range from cowhands between drives to travelling salesmen, railroad clerks, schoolteachers, and prospectors temporarily flush with cash, all of them paid for more than just a mattress. They bought hot meals cooked on a weary stove, someone to wash their shirts once in a while, and a thin layer of domestic routine that made chaotic towns feel less like camps and more like communities. The woman running the house kept books, negotiated rates, ordered food in bulk, managed credit, and enforced rules about noise, alcohol, and visitors, wielding more authority inside her walls than many men enjoyed outside them. Her parlour could double as an informal job office, message drop, or matchmaking space. Guests learned who was hiring, who had skipped town owing money, and which claims might be worth a look. Yet this work was also grueling and precarious. Long days on her feet, constant cooking, cleaning, and the need to keep peace among men who might arrive drunk, homesick, or angry. In a world that often painted frontier women as either school marms or dance hall girls, the boarding house keeper occupied a quieter but crucial middle ground, an entrepreneur, landlord, cook, and sometimes confidante whose business helped give transient places something like a beating heart. 59. For all the romance around frontier doctors galloping through the night with their black bags, the everyday reality of medical care across much of the West rested heavily on people who had never seen the inside of a medical school. Midwives, some indigenous, some black, some Mexican, some immigrant women carrying old-world knowledge, travelled from cabin to cabin, assisting births with a mix of inherited techniques, herbal remedies and hard-won experience that came from seeing dozens, sometimes hundreds, of deliveries. In many settlements, they were the only consistent care for women, especially when trained physicians were scarce, expensive, or unwilling to travel in bad weather. Alongside them worked practical healers and granny women who set bones, mixed poultices and prescribed teas or tonics based on plants that grew along creek beds and in kitchen gardens, blending traditions from Europe, Africa and the Americas. Some of what they did would later be confirmed as sound, sanitizing tools encouraging rest, using certain herbs for pain or infection, while other practices, like bloodletting or certain purges, reflected the limited medical understanding of the time. Formal doctors, when present, might scoff at or collaborate with these practitioners, depending on personality and circumstance. But in the dead of winter, hours from town, judgment mattered less than whether someone could stop a hemorrhage, help a baby breathe, or ease the agony of a crushed limb. Communities often remembered their midwives and folk healers with deep, almost reverent affection, even as later histories focused on men with diplomas. On a landscape where distance and weather turned minor problems into emergencies, these mostly unsung caregivers formed an improvised safety net, catching lives that official institutions could barely reach. 60. If home remedies and midwives formed one layer of frontier medicine, another, more dubious layer arrived in bright labels and grand promises sealed inside glass bottles and tin cans. Patent medicines, so-called despite often having no actual patents, flooded the West through newspapers, travelling wagons, and, eventually those same mail-order catalogues, marketing cure-alls that claimed to treat everything from nervousness and indigestion to tuberculosis and female troubles. Many of these concoctions were more intoxicant than treatment, laced with generous amounts of alcohol, opium, cocaine, or other powerful ingredients that dulled pain and lifted moods without addressing underlying problems, leaving some users quietly dependent. Others contained little more than flavoured water, sugar, and a dash of herbs, relying on confident testimonials, dramatic before and after illustrations, and the natural tendency of some illnesses to improve on their own. On the frontier where trained physicians were few, hospitals nearly non-existent, and local gossip might be the only review system, these bottles filled a desperate gap. A rancher miles from town with a sick child, a miner whose lungs burned from dust, or a woman worn down by childbirth and work might reach for whatever sat on the kitchen shelf, bearing the boldest assurance of relief. Newspapers and local officials occasionally pushed back, especially after spectacular scandals or poisonings, but regulation lagged behind marketing for decades. By the time stricter laws and medical standards began reigning in the most dangerous claims in the early 20th century, generations of Westerners had lived and died under the influence of remedies whose main active ingredient was hope, cleverly bottled and sold into places where real help was hard to find. 61. By the late 19th century, the myth of healing air had become its own migration pattern, and nowhere drew more desperate pilgrims than the high, dry plateaus and desert basins of the American West. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, had no real cure, but doctors and ad men alike promised that arid climates, pine-scented breezes, and high-altitude sunshine could slow the disease, so invalid trains and consumption specials carried pale, coughing patients from crowded eastern cities to Colorado Springs, Tucson, Santa Fe, and tiny tent colonies scattered along new rail lines, where they lay bundled in blankets on porches in all seasons, slept with windows propped open in winter, and carefully measured walks around sanatorium grounds, clinging to the idea that each breath of thin, dry air might buy them a little more time than the damp back-alley tenements they'd left behind. 62. Those who didn't survive the West's promises often ended up on wind-swept hillsides that towns grimly nicknamed Boot Hill, a phrase that popped up in multiple places: Dodge City, Tombstone, and a half-dozen lesser-known settlements, each claiming its own origin story but generally circling the same macabre idea. A burial ground for men who died with their boots on, meaning suddenly, violently, or far from family, whether by gunshot, hanging, disease, or simple bad luck. In reality, some boot. Hills were formal cemeteries with plots, markers, and grieving relatives, while others were rough, rocky patches where wooden crosses leaned and weather-erased names, and the romantic image of outlaw graveyards, later painted by dime novels and Western films, glossed over the more mundane truth that most of the dead were ordinary labourers, immigrants, and drifters, whose only common trait was dying in a place where the town needed to put a fence around mortality. 63. While many frontier farmers struggled to coax crops from stingy rainfall and unpredictable rivers, Mormon settlements across Utah, parts of Idaho, Arizona, and Nevada quietly transformed deserts into patchworks of green through an intense cooperative approach to water that mixed religious discipline with practical engineering, guided by church leadership and a strong ethic of collective responsibility. Communities surveyed canals before they built houses, dug ditches by hand in organized work. Parties and assigned maintenance duties and water turns through local councils, turning irrigation into both infrastructure and social glue, so that a neighbour who skipped ditch cleaning might find more than just muddy fields awaiting him at Sunday services, and the resulting networks of canals, weirs, and reservoirs allowed small scattered towns to support orchards, sugar beets, alfalfa, and wheat in valleys that earlier explorers had written off as nearly useless, reshaping both landscapes, and local power in ways surrounding non-Mormon ranchers and farmers, sometimes resented and envied in equal measure. 64. Long before American flags, cattle fences, and railroad depots spread across the Southwest, Hispano communities in what is now New Mexico had already spent centuries building a deeply rooted world of adobe villages, irrigated fields, and parish-centered life that rarely fits the later image of a raw, unsettled frontier. Descendants of early Spanish colonists and indigenous peoples carved narrow fields along acequias, community-managed irrigation ditches governed by their own customs, raised sheep on upland commons, and tied everyday routines to the rhythms of Catholic feast days and extended kin networks that linked tiny plazas to larger centers like Santa Fe and Albuquerque. So when Anglo settlers, speculators, and officials arrived after the Mexican-American War, they didn't encounter empty space but an existing society with its own land grants, language, and legal traditions, which federal courts and surveyors often ignored or reshaped, fueling decades of conflict, dispossession, and quiet resistance that sit uneasily beside the usual tale of brave pioneers marching into wilderness. 65. On the open range and long trail drives that fed booming railhead towns, a sizable share of the cowboys steering half-wild, Texas cattle north were black men whose presence later Western movies mostly erased. Some estimates put them at a quarter or even more of working hands after the Civil War. Many of them formerly enslaved people who traded plantation fields for saddles, rope, and the uncertain freedom of seasonal work. They rode night herd, broke broncs, navigated swollen rivers, and endured The same monotonous beans, dust and loneliness as their white counterparts, often for less pay and with fewer chances at promotion to trail boss. Yet on the trail itself, skill with a horse and a lariat mattered more than skin colour, and camp etiquette sometimes muted the brutal racism waiting in nearby towns where black cowboys risked segregated saloons, limited lodging, and sudden violence, even as white authors and illustrators later lifted their techniques, slang, and style to create the iconic cowboy image without acknowledging the men who'd helped shape it. 66. When official maps labelled huge swaths of the post-Civil War West as Indian country and unorganized territory, the United States Army sent in regiments of black soldiers, known collectively as Buffalo Soldiers, to patrol the emptiness between forts, escort mail coaches, chase raiding parties, and lay telegraph lines, even as many of those same soldiers were barred from white neighborhoods and faced discrimination from their own officers. The nickname Buffalo Soldier, often attributed to Plains tribes who supposedly saw a resemblance to the shaggy resilience of the buffalo, carried a mix of respect and stereotype, and their assignments ranged from brutal campaigns against native resistance in Texas, the southern plains and the southwest, to relatively quiet stints building roads, mapping mountain passes, and later protecting national parks such as Yosemite and Sequoia before there was a formal park service, placing them in the morally tangled position of black men who had just emerged from slavery or its shadow, now enforcing federal power over other marginalized peoples on a landscape where their courage earned medals, but rarely full acceptance. 67. After the Civil War, when the army needed warm bodies more than it needed careful paperwork, Cathay Williams slipped through the cracks by doing something technically simple and personally enormous. She cut her hair, bound her chest, took the name William Cathay, and enlisted in the 38th U.S. Infantry, making her the only documented black woman to serve as a Buffalo Soldier, marching through heat, cold, and chronic illness across Missouri, Kansas, and New Mexico, while constantly risking exposure not just as a woman in a men's barracks, but as someone whose very act of enlistment violated army rules. Her superiors eventually discovered the secret after repeated hospital visits, discharged her, and left her to scrape by on odd jobs and failing health. And when she later applied for a pension as a disabled veteran, the government denied her, saying she hadn't served legally enough for the benefits her body had already paid for. 68. While dime novels obsessed over fictional sharpshooters, one of the most relentless real lawmen of the West was Bass Reeves, a formerly enslaved man who escaped bondage during the Civil War, fled into Indian Territory, learned multiple native languages, and eventually returned wearing a badge as a deputy U.S. Marshal out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, riding for decades through what was then one of the most violent jurisdictions in the country. He reportedly arrested thousands of fugitives, horse thieves, killers, bootleggers, using disguises, patience, and a frighteningly steady aim. And there are stories, hard to fully prove but often repeated, that he once arrested his own son for murder rather than let another deputy do it, insisting that the law had to apply equally. Later writers have wondered if he helped inspire the Lone Ranger legend, a theory that can't be nailed down but feels fitting in a West where the real hero rarely looked like the masked man on the movie screen. 69. For the Navajo, or Diné, the trauma remembered as the long walk did not end when the marching stopped, because after Union troops forced them from their homelands in the 1860s, burning crops, slaughtering sheep, and driving men, women, and children hundreds of miles in winter to the bleak Bosque Redondo Reservation in eastern New Mexico, years of starvation, disease, and failed attempts to turn a swampy, alkaline piece of land into farms carved deep wounds that even the eventual Treaty of 1868 couldn't simply erase. That agreement allowed the Navajo to return to a portion of their homeland and re-establish a reservation. But they came back to a landscape already scarred by military posts, encroaching settlers and reduced grazing, with their flocks, orchards, and social networks shattered. So the return was less a restoration than a long, difficult rebuilding under constant federal oversight, ration dependence, and boundary disputes that still echo in land use battles and memory. Today, 70. Long before Hollywood turned galloping silhouettes into cliché, the arrival and spread of horses across the plains set off a quiet revolution in how many indigenous nations moved, hunted, traded, and made war, especially among the Lakota and their relatives, who adapted quickly to four-legged speed after Spanish horses filtered north through raids, trade, and capture over generations. What had once required days on foot suddenly took hours. Buffalo hunts became mobile, coordinated chases. Instead of slow drives and seasonal rounds expanded as families could carry larger tippies, more possessions and more meat, tying wealth and status increasingly to horse herds, while also intensifying conflicts over territory, access to grazing and raiding. This horse-centered way of life, rich in its own aesthetics and rituals, reached its height only a few decades before US. Military campaigns, fencing and railroads began choking off open ranges and bison herds, making its brilliance and brevity part of the same historical flash. 71. Before bison skulls were stacked in trainside mountains and hides shipped by the boxcar, the great herds that moved across the plains were more than just background scenery for many native nations. They were the axis around which entire economies, calendars, and spiritual systems turned, providing thick robes for winter, rawhide for shield covers, sinew for bowstrings and sewing, bones for tools, stomachs for cooking vessels, dung for fuel, and meat that could be eaten fresh, dried into jerky, or pounded into pemmican mixed with fat and berries. Hunting parties timed their movements to migrations, camps shifted with the seasons, and trade networks stretched from the Rockies to the Mississippi, as surplus hides, meat, and crafted goods were exchanged for guns, metal, and later manufactured items, creating a flexible, resilient way of living that adapted to change but still depended on one crucial fact. The herds, though hunted, still existed in numbers that made abundance feel almost like a law of nature. 72. That sense of endless abundance vanished with startling speed once railroads, repeaters, and federal policy aligned to turn the bison from keystone to commodity, as commercial hunters, railroad passengers, and government-sanctioned contractors poured onto the plains in the late 19th century with high-powered rifles, industrial tanning operations, and an explicit or implied understanding that destroying the herds would also help break the resistance of the native nations who depended on them. Within a few decades, tens of millions of animals dwindled to a ragged scatter of survivors, carcasses left to rot after tongues and hides were taken, bones later gathered for fertilizer, and photographs of bleached skull piles turned into grim postcards of progress, while some politicians openly described the slaughter as a strategy to force indigenous people onto reservations. Scattered conservation efforts by ranchers, zoos, and indigenous caretakers kept the species from vanishing entirely, but the ecological and cultural collapse that followed never fully reversed, only partially patched over by small managed herds. 73. On paper, the reservation system guaranteed rations, flour, sugar, coffee, bacon, blankets in exchange for land cessions and peace. But in practice, those sacks and barrels became levers of control, because Indian agents decided who got full measures, who got mouldy leftovers, and who got quietly cut off, turning food into a weapon that could punish political rivals, reward compliant headmen, and coerce signatures on new agreements. Deliveries were late or lost, contractors padded bills with rotten meat, and people who had once fed themselves through hunting, farming, and gathering found their survival tied to a distant bureaucracy and the whims of a local official who might skim, cheat, or simply not care, so that lines at ration houses became daily reminders that the government's promise of support after confinement was less about compassion and more about dependence, discipline, and a paper trail that claimed obligations were met, even when stomachs and storage pits said. Otherwise, 74. When reformers talked about saving native children through education, the boarding school system they pushed into existence, places like Carlisle, Haskell, and dozens of smaller institutions scattered near reservations, really aimed to erase languages, ceremonies, clothing, and even haircuts, replacing them with English, uniforms, Christian prayers, and military-style drills under mottos like "Kill the Indian, save the man." While children as young as 5 were taken far from home, sometimes by force or threats of cutting off their families' rations. Once inside, they were punished for speaking their own languages, given new names, marched to class and church, put to work in fields or laundries to keep the school running, and often malnourished or abused, with high rates of illness and death poorly recorded or left off the books entirely. And although some students later said they found friendships, skills, or small pockets of resistance, many survivors remembered the schools as places where homesickness, shame, and fear were standard parts of the curriculum. 75. In the late 1880s, as reservations tightened and bison vanished, word of a new spiritual movement spread from Nevada outward, a vision taught by Wovoka, a Paiute prophet, who said that if native people lived peacefully, performed a specific round dance, and followed certain instructions, a great renewal would come. Sometimes described as the return of ancestors, the disappearance of white rule, and the restoration of lost lands and animals, among Lakota and other Plains nations, the ghost dance took on its own meanings and hopes, with some dancers sewing special shirts they believed might offer protection. But to reservation agents, army officers, and nervous settlers, any large gathering of desperate people looked like the start of a rebellion, not a prayer meeting. So reports of wild ceremonies were passed up the chain as evidence of looming war, and the mix of misunderstanding, fear, and existing military anxiety around figures like Sitting Bull helped turn a ritual of grief and longing into a pretext for crackdowns. 76. By the winter of 1890, the US government had broken most major armed resistance on the plains, but fear and suspicion still ran high, and when a band of Miniconjou Lakota led by Spotted Elk, often called Bigfoot, fled their reservation in the wake of ghost dance tensions, they were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry and escorted to a campsite at Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota, where soldiers ringed the tipis with Hotchkiss guns and began a tense disarming process the next morning. What exactly sparked the first shot is still argued, whether it came from a deaf Lakota man struggling with his rifle or from nervous troopers, but within moments the guns opened up on men, women, and children, killing perhaps 150 to more than 250 Lakota, depending on the account, and scattering bodies into ravines and snowdrifts, while the army later framed the event as a battle and handed out medals of honor, leaving Wounded Knee to become a symbol of the West's closing chapter written in blood instead of treaties. 77. Far to the southwest, in the rugged borderlands of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico, the man Anglos called Geronimo, Goyale in Apache, spent years slipping between worlds, leading small bands of Chiricahua Apache who refused to settle permanently on distant reservations. And his story was not a single last stand, but a series of uneasy truces, escapes, and negotiations that reflected both his determination and the fractures within his own people. He surrendered multiple times, under promises of fair treatment, only to bolt again when he believed those promises were broken, or when confinement, rations, and surveillance felt like slow death, using intimate knowledge of mountains, canyons, and desert waterholes to evade far larger forces of US and Mexican troops, scouts, and militia. When he finally agreed to a last surrender in 1886, after a long pursuit involving thousands of soldiers and Apache scouts hunting other Apache, he and his followers were shipped east as prisoners of war, some never returning to their homelands. while newspapers turned his name into a legend that often obscured the very specific grievances and betrayals that had kept him running. 78. One of the strangest ironies of the Apache Wars is that some of the most effective soldiers tracking Geronimo and other holdouts were Apache scouts themselves, men from various Apache bands who signed on with the US. Army for pay, rations, weapons, and a chance to protect their own families or settle scores with rival groups, choices that outsiders often reduced to loyalty or betrayal, but which in context were survival strategies in a landscape where the old economy of raiding and trading was collapsing under military posts and railroads. These scouts brought an unmatched knowledge of trails, water sources and tactics, moving silently ahead of blue-coated columns, reading tracks that white officers could barely see, sometimes arguing with commanders over how a campaign should proceed, and sometimes pushing back when they felt their people were being mistreated. Yet when the wars ended, many were discharged without long-term guarantees, and some Chiricahua scouts were even imprisoned alongside those they had helped pursue, a reminder that in the end the army valued their skills but not always their futures, leaving their descendants to carry complicated memories of ancestors who fought for and against different flags in the same canyons. 79. Long before Hollywood imagined lone cowboys at dusty trading posts, there were Comancheros, mobile New Mexican traders who rode out from settlements like Las Vegas and Taos with wagons, piled high in a creaking bilingual marketplace, hauling blankets, cloth, flour, tobacco, metal tools, liquor, and, crucially, firearms into the territory of Comanche, Kiowa, and other plains peoples, and then returning with strings of stolen horses and mules, buffalo robes, dried meat, captives ransomed or traded, and whatever else the border economy produced, moving through a grey zone that was sometimes blessed, sometimes condemned by officials, depending on who needed whose help that season. Mexican and later American authorities denounced them as smugglers and fencemen for raided livestock one month, then quietly relied on their relationships with powerful plains bands the next. Because Comancheros could ride into camps, most outsiders would never survive, speak the languages, share the feasts, and return with intelligence about shifting alliances, drought, war plans, and where the real power sat on the southern plains, making them simultaneously indispensable go-betweens and convenient scapegoats, whenever policy in Santa Fe or Washington needed someone to blame for frontier violence. 80. When people imagine the Santa Fe Trail, they often picture a single dusty track cutting through empty land. But the trail was really a braided commercial artery linking Missouri river towns like Independence and Westport to the plazas of Santa Fe and beyond, carrying the factory-made goods of the early industrial East, cotton cloth, hardware, glassware, firearms, books, fancy hats, even pianos, westward in groaning ox-drawn caravans that moved in guarded columns while the eastbound wagons rolled, back-stacked with Mexican silver coins, bars of bullion, wool, woven blankets, mules, donkeys, and cultural influences you couldn't pack in a crate, like language, songs, and Catholic imagery. Merchants who ran the trail weren't just frontier adventurers, they were early global traders plugged into networks that reached to New York, London, and Mexico City, calculating risks from Comanche raids, drought, or bankrupt partners, just like later railroad tycoons would worry about stock prices and grain rates, and every campsite along the Arkansas River or Cimarron Cutoff became a temporary town of its own, where Mexican teamsters, Anglo traders, mixed heritage guides, and native visitors bargained, shared news, swapped recipes, and argued politics, turning a line on the map into a moving border where three nations' laws, currencies, and ambitions collided under the stars. 81. On a low bluff above the Arkansas River, in what is now southeastern Colorado, Bent's Fort rose from the plains not as a military outpost or government installation, but as a private commercial hub, adobe walls, broad gates, and interior rooms making a kind of prairie castle where Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Comanche, Ute, Mexican traders, American trappers, and overland emigrants all converged, each group seeing the place through a slightly different lens. For Plains nations, Bent's Fort was a reliable source of guns, ammunition, metal goods, cloth, and coffee, as well as a diplomatic stage where councils were held, treaties discussed, and rivalries managed over pipes and trade goods. While for Santa Fe traders it was both warehouse and way station, a place to repair wagons, rest animals, and hire guides who actually understood the country. Missionaries and army officers dropped by to observe and report. Artists sketched, and hungry emigrants staggered in from the high plains dust to find stew, stories, and maybe a little news about what lay ahead, so that the fort functioned like an early multicultural intersection, where one might hear Cheyenne and Spanish mixed with English slang in the same courtyard, and where decisions made in casual conversations could ripple outward into alliances, misunderstandings, and, eventually, conflicts that reshaped the southern plains. 82. Before railroads stitched the Rockies with iron and telegraphs crackled news across the continent in minutes, the isolated world of mountain trappers depended on a completely different information network, one that pulsed to life once a year at the fur trade rendezvous, temporary boom towns that sprang up in high meadows or river valleys of what's now Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, or western Colorado. When company clerks, pack trains loaded with trade goods, free trappers, native families, and mixed heritage intermediaries all converged for a few dizzying weeks. Here the year's worth of beaver pelts and other furs changed hands for powder, lead, traps, clothing, coffee, sugar, rum, tobacco, bright cloth, and whatever luxuries could be crammed onto mules coming from St. Louis, while news of distant wars, broken contracts, marriages, deaths, new passes through the mountains, rumours of gold, and reports of hostile or friendly bands flowed from fire circle to fire circle, stitching far-flung camps into one shared mental map of the West. These rendezvous were scenes of hard bargaining, games, horse races, feasts, religious ceremonies, and staggering drunkenness, but they were also annual planning conferences where trappers, native partners, and company men recalibrated strategies for the next year's work, quietly acknowledging that nobody in these wild-looking gatherings was actually operating alone. Every success depended on layered alliances and carefully maintained relationships. 83. The beaver themselves didn't know it, but for a few intense decades in the early 1800s, European and American fashion elites decided that the must-have material for hats, the essential ingredient in looking respectable, wealthy, and modern, was felt made from beaver fur, and that preference turned quiet creeks and high country streams across the West into economically valuable frontiers that mapmakers and politicians barely understood. Companies like the American Fur Company and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, along with British and Canadian rivals, sent waves of trappers into remote river systems from the Missouri headwaters to the Snake and the Green, pushing small parties of men to cross passes, record valleys, and learn from native guides where the densest populations of beaver sign could be found, and the fur packets they hauled out each year justified maps, forts, and policy decisions that imagined this watery web as future territory for nations rather than homelands already occupied. Then, almost as quickly as it had begun, the beaver hat craze collapsed by mid-century, as silk hats came into fashion, and beaver populations crashed from overtrapping, leaving many seasoned mountain men suddenly holding skills calibrated to a market that had evaporated, forcing them to pivot, some becoming guides for emigrant trails or army expeditions, others fading into marginal work, while the rivers they had followed remained on charts and in military reports, guiding future waves who had no idea their path was traced by a dead fashion trend. 84. Among those who outlasted the fur trade's rise and fall, Jim Bridger became legendary not just for surviving brutal winters and knowing a web of mountain passes, but for the way he turned that knowledge into stories that blurred the line between field report and frontier myth, making listeners unsure whether they were hearing geology, hallucination, or a bit of both. Bridger guided soldiers, emigrants, and surveyors through the Rockies and into what's now Yellowstone country, and when he tried to describe features like geysers, boiling springs, petrified forests, and canyon walls that seemed painted by some impossible hand, many educated Easterners and army officers assumed he was spinning tall tales, lumping accurate observations like rivers that ran so clear you could see a trout wink at you 40 feet down, in with wilder claims about mountains of glass or streams that flowed so steep fish fell out. Yet those same listeners later marched through landscapes that looked suspiciously like his most outlandish accounts. This blend of precise route knowledge, playful exaggeration, and sometimes deliberate misdirection. Because a guide who gave away every shortcut too easily might soon be unnecessary, meant Bridger's stories helped open the West and also helped obscure it, reminding us that many of the earliest facts written into reports and guidebooks came filtered through personalities who understood that in a region where few outsiders could check the details, entertainment and authority often traveled together. 85. If you want an early frontier story that sounds like an ultra-marathon fever dream, you get John Coulter's famous Run, the tale told and retold around campfires about the former Lewis and Clark scout, who left the relative safety of the returning expedition to trap beaver in Blackfeet country, and was supposedly captured with a partner, stripped naked on the wide prairie, and given a head start by his pursuers as a kind of cruel sport. According to the legend, Coulter took off at a dead sprint, feet tearing open on stones and prickly pear, lungs burning in the thin air, as armed warriors pounded behind him, until one collapsed from exhaustion and Coulter seized the moment, killing that man with his own spear, then diving into a river choked with driftwood, where he hid inside a logjam for hours, blood, sweat, and river water mixing, while the Blackfeet searched the banks above. When the sun finally dropped and the searchers withdrew, Coulter crawled out half dead and walked, limped, and stumbled hundreds of miles to a trading post with nothing but his endurance and whatever roots or scraps he could find. An escape so brutal that later historians have argued about how much is accurate and how much has been exaggerated. But either way, the story fixed his name as one of the first great survival legends of the American West and set the tone for how people would talk about frontier toughness for generations. 86. If Coulter's Run became a legend of endurance, the Donner Party became the cautionary whisper at every campfire on the overland trails. A story that emigrant parents hoped their children didn't hear clearly, because it turned an already dangerous journey into something nightmarish. In 1846, this group of families set out for California, like thousands of others, wagons creaking westward with bedding, tools, hopes, and the usual mix of optimism and ignorance. But somewhere along the way, they decided to gamble on a shortcut, Lansford Hastings' much-hyped Hastings Cut-Off, advertised in a guidebook as a faster, better route across the Great Basin and over the Sierra Nevada. The problem was, Hastings hadn't actually led a full wagon train through it, and the path turned out to be slower, rougher, and far more exhausting than the main trail, forcing the Donner Group to hack new road through mountain thickets, drag wagons over salt flats where animals collapsed, and lose precious weeks of summer that the Sierra snows would eventually steal from them. By the time they reached the eastern slope of the Sierras, early winter storms hit, trapping their weakened, hungry party in makeshift cabins and tents near what's now Donner Lake, where food vanished, livestock died, and the line between survival and horror blurred so much that some turned to cannibalism, a choice that would haunt American memory. In the years afterward, emigrant guides quietly stopped praising untested shortcuts. Trail gossip magnified every mention of the Donner name, and the idea took hold that in the West, a single bad decision, like trusting a charismatic pamphlet over cautious experience, could turn an ordinary wagon train into one of the most infamous disasters in frontier history. 87. Stories like the Donner Parties were exactly the sort of thing many emigrants tried not to dwell on as they jolted westward along the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. But death rode along in the wagons whether anyone talked about it or not, and one of the quieter, more haunting practices that developed was the way some families tried to hide their loved ones' graves from the landscape itself. When someone died on the trail from cholera, accident, childbirth, or simple exhaustion, the wagon train would usually halt just long enough to perform a quick burial nearby. But people quickly realized that obvious graves could attract scavenging animals, grave robbers, or even just become depressing signposts for the next parties passing through. Each mound a reminder of how thin the margin of survival really was. So, many groups began to disguise their burial spots, digging under the packed earth of the actual wagon road, then filling the grave and letting the next wagons roll directly over it until the surface looked like any other stretch of track, or placing the grave beneath a fire pit, a corral, or a camp kitchen, so that trampling feet and hooves erased any fresh marks. In some accounts, families removed markers or avoided putting up crosses altogether, choosing memory over monuments, because they feared that seeing too many graves along the way might sap the courage of those behind them. This simple, practical camouflage meant countless emigrants still lie, literally, beneath the ghost of the trail itself, their resting places invisible to modern travelers who drive the same corridors on paved highways, unaware that the road has been a cemetery since the first wagons passed. 88. The hidden graves are a clue to another quiet truth of the overland migrations that doesn't fit neatly with Hollywood shootouts and arrow-filled ambush scenes. The West's trails were deadlier because of water, mud, and illness than because of any classic Indian attack, and river crossings in particular became some of the most feared obstacles on the route. Emigrants had to ford or ferry dozens of rivers and creeks, from the milky, glacier-fed Platte and the looping Green to smaller but deceptively dangerous streams swollen by sudden storms, and each crossing required decisions that could turn catastrophic in seconds. Do you float the wagons or caulk them and hope they don't tip? Do you wade the oxen first? Do you wait for water levels to drop and risk wasting time? Many parties lost entire loads when a wagon tipped midstream, its canvas cover turning into a waterlogged anchor, sucking down tools, food, and sometimes children who fell underneath and drowned before anyone could reach them in the churning current. Livestock, the literal engines of the journey, could be swept away, broken-legged, or simply refused to move, and rescuers sometimes drowned trying to save them. On top of that, bad weather turned crossing approaches into quagmires, where wagons bogged axle-deep, men and women heaving at wheels in sleet and hail, while lightning cracked above and hypothermia hit the soaked, exhausted travellers who had just spent hours in icy water. When emigrant diaries survived, they often recorded that more people were taken by rivers, overturned wagons, accidental gun discharges, and disease than by any deliberate attack, reminding us that on the real trail to Oregon or California, the most consistent killers wore the faces of geography and chance rather than human enemies. 89. Disease lurked in that same water, and if rivers killed swiftly, cholera killed even faster, turning long stretches of the Oregon and California trails into something like slow-motion epidemics that moved west with the wagon ruts. Cholera thrives where water sources are contaminated by human waste, and crowded campsites along rivers and springs were perfect breeding grounds, especially when hurried emigrants dug latrines too close to where they filled their buckets, or when dozens of parties camped in the same favoured spots week after week, each one leaving behind invisible danger for the next. Once cholera took hold in a train, the symptoms could appear with terrifying speed. Cramps, violent vomiting, and massive diarrhea that left people dehydrated and delirious within hours, sometimes dead by nightfall after seeming healthy in the morning their bodies wrapped and buried beside the road because the train couldn't linger. Contemporary travelers wrote of grave after grave marked, cholera along the Platte and other major routes, of wagons steering around death scenes where families huddled, of entire groups staggering forward short-handed because so many adults had been lost. Medical knowledge was limited, so people tried folk cures, prayer, or quarantines that often came too late, and some began to suspect that certain hotbeds, stagnant puddles, crowded riverbanks, shallow wells were cursed. Naming them accordingly, historians estimate that thousands, possibly tens of thousands, died of cholera on the trails in the peak migration years, far exceeding the numbers lost in any single skirmish, which means that for many emigrants, the most frightening enemy of the West wasn't a gunman or a warrior on the horizon, but the cup of water in their own hand. 90. While most emigrants were battling mud, rivers, and disease, the U.S. Army was running its own odd frontier experiment that feels like it wandered in from another story entirely. The Camel Corps, a mid-1850s project that asked whether the deserts of the American Southwest might better suit animals from the sands of North Africa and the Middle East than the traditional horse and mule, under Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. The Army imported dozens of camels and brought in experienced handlers, turning parts of Texas and what's now Arizona into improbable testing. Grounds where caravans of long-legged, bad-tempered animals shuffled through cactus and mesquite, reportedly carrying heavier loads, going longer without water, and handling rocky terrain better than mules, all while terrifying local horses and mules who wanted nothing to do with the strange-smelling newcomers. Officers who used the camels often wrote favorably about their stamina, and some experiments, like surveying expeditions or mail runs, demonstrated that they could outperform the standard pack animals. But the program ran into a wall of practical and cultural resistance. American soldiers hated dealing with them. Their specialized handlers were few, and the looming Civil War diverted money, attention, and political will away from exotic experiments. When the war came, the camels were sold off, turned loose, or quietly absorbed into odd corners of civilian life, leading to later sightings of wild camels drifting through the desert like misplaced ghosts of a different continent, and leaving behind the sense that the United States had, for a brief moment, nearly gone in a very different direction for its frontier logistics. One where the classic image of a cavalry column might have included hissing, saddle-laden camels instead of long-eared mules. 91. If the Camel Corps feels like a strange desert experiment, Fort Bowie at Apache Pass shows how brutally practical the Army could be when a specific piece of ground mattered, because this lonely post in what's now southeastern Arizona existed for one simple, ruthless reason: to hold a narrow corridor where a reliable spring cut through harsh mountains and desert that otherwise punished travelers for miles in every direction, a place that had been a crucial indigenous route long before any. American flag flew there, and that Apache groups, especially under leaders like Cochise and later Geronimo, understood as a lifeline worth defending when the Butterfield Overland Mail and then the U.S. military pushed through. Clashes at Apache Pass convinced the Army that whoever controlled that water controlled east-west movement, so they built Fort Bowie literally to pin down that spring, stationing troops whose main job was not glorious charges but exhausting patrols, escorting wagon trains, and enforcing a new reality in which Apache families who had always moved through that terrain suddenly found an armed gatehouse planted on their own historic crossroads. 92. The men inside Fort Bowie and nearly every settler, priest or merchant across the arid West quickly learned that survival in those climates wasn't just about who had the most guns, but who understood heat, shade, and materials, which is where adobe architecture quietly undercuts Hollywood's endless rows of wooden saloons by reminding us that much of the real West was built out of sun-baked earth, thick adobe walls, basically bricks made from mud, straw, and patience, created heavy, insulating shells that soaked up daytime heat slowly, keeping interior rooms dim and relatively cool even when the outside air shimmered, then bled that stored warmth back out at night when desert temperatures crashed, giving people a kind of passive air conditioning centuries before anyone dreamed of an electric fan, layered with whitewashed lime, timber vigas, and sometimes flat roofs that doubled as sleeping platforms under the stars. These structures came from indigenous and Spanish colonial traditions long predating American annexation, and when Anglo newcomers discovered that their draughty wooden cabins turned into ovens at noon and iceboxes by dawn, many adopted adobe because it simply worked better than anything they brought in their wagons. 93. Water made the walls useful, and nowhere is the story of shared scarcity more obvious than in the acequias of the southwest, those unassuming irrigation ditches that look like muddy trenches, until you understand that they're actually physical lines of law, community and memory carved into the land, adapted from Spanish and North African models and intertwined with Pueblo and other indigenous practices. Acequias carried snowmelt and river water to fields that would otherwise be dust, but they weren't just engineering projects, they were social contracts, managed by local mayordomos and user associations that decided, often in long argumentative meetings, who got how much water, on which days, and in what order, with rules that could be written in legal codes or unwritten, but strictly remembered by elders. Farmers took turns cleaning the ditches in communal workdays, and disputes over a single headgate or minor diversion sometimes flared into feuds, because in a place where a bad year of rain could kill a harvest, the right to pull water from an acequia meant the difference between staying on the land or being forced to sell out, which is why so many of these centuries-old systems still exist, defended not just as historic curiosities, but as living frameworks of shared responsibility in landscapes that have never had water to waste. 94. Follow those ditches, trails and wagon ruts north and east, and you eventually hit San Antonio, a place that stubbornly refuses to fit into a single neat category, too Mexican to be simply American, too Texan to be simply Mexican, and too old to be defined only by the Alamo myth that later tourists fixated on. In the 18th and 19th centuries, San Antonio sat at the meeting point of Spanish missions, Comanche raiding grounds, cattle trails, and later U.S. military roads, which meant that its plazas and dusty streets saw Franciscans ringing bells, vaqueros driving longhorns, German settlers opening shops, African-American soldiers mustering at frontier forts, and cartloads of cotton, hides and manufactured goods creaking in and out toward the Gulf Coast or the interior of Mexico. The city functioned as a transit hub where languages blended in markets, where you could hear gossip about distant New Mexico caravans in the same tavern, where officers discussed campaigns against indigenous nations, and where ranching families, small-time traders and army quartermasters all depended on the same web of routes that made San Antonio less a remote outpost and more a buzzing borderlands heart whose pulse you could trace along the roads rippling outward across Texas. 95. Follow that pulse farther west and it becomes a double heartbeat at El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, two cities that the map pretends are separate, but which have long functioned as a single organism stretched across the Rio Grande, sharing labor, families and risk in ways that made the legal border feel more like a suggestion than a wall for most of their history. In the 19th century frontier era, ranchers grazed animals on both sides without obsessing over which flag flew overhead that decade. Smugglers moved contraband with the same creativity they do now, and merchants treated the river as a transport route, not a hard line, ferrying flour, tools and textiles in one direction and ore, cattle or cheap manufactured goods in the other. When the railroad finally stitched through, El Paso blossomed as a U.S. commercial node, while Juarez thrived on complementary industries and services, and people crossed back and forth for work, fiestas, marriages and revolutions. Literally, in the case of Mexican revolutionaries who used the border's ambiguity as cover, creating a shared economy where a downturn, crackdown or boom on one bank sent ripples across the water to the other, tying frontier fates to each other much more tightly than they were to distant capitals. 96. That logic of crossing to where the rules felt looser found one of its flashiest expressions farther west in Tijuana, and along the Baja California peninsula, where the border's proximity made the region a kind of pressure valve for Americans who wanted thrills they couldn't easily get at home. And local entrepreneurs were happy to oblige. By the late 19th and especially early 20th centuries, racetracks, gambling halls, and entertainment districts sprang up in Tijuana and Ensenada, often backed by US and Mexican capital that understood perfectly well that restrictive laws north of the line, whether about alcohol, betting, or later prohibition, could be turned into profit by offering exactly those forbidden pleasures a short train ride or drive away. Well-dressed Americans came down to watch horse races, place bets, drink freely, and mingle in hotels that marketed themselves as cosmopolitan playgrounds at the edge of nowhere, while local workers, musicians, and vendors built livelihoods around serving that flow of visitors. The arrangement generated tensions, moral panics, and occasional crackdowns. But it also cemented the idea that the border itself was not just a political division, but a business model, a line you could cross for a weekend to step temporarily outside your own country's rules before going home, sunburned, poorer, and full of stories. 97. If you zoom in from glamorous border resort towns back into the dusty interior of New Mexico in the late 1870s, the Lincoln County War looks at first glance like one more chaotic shootout saga tailor-made for dime novels. But underneath the gunsmoke, it was really a vicious corporate feud in a place with barely any formal law, where a monopoly dry goods and cattle firm known as the House, Murphy and Dolan, tied into established political bosses and the territorial governor, controlled government contracts, credit, and the local sheriff's office, until a rival partnership backed by out-of-town capital, Tunstall and McSween, tried to wedge in with their own store, bank, and alliances to discontented ranchers and smallholders who resented being forever in debt to the house. When legal tactics and threats failed, both sides weaponized the thin, corrupt law enforcement system, with sheriff's posses, deputized gunmen, and hired regulators turning court papers into hunting licenses, and the war that followed, ambushes in arroyos, house sieges, assassinations in town streets, was less a spontaneous eruption of frontier honor than a grim, localized civil war over who got to skim the profits, hand out jobs, and define justice in a county where the courthouse and the mercantile counter were just two fronts in the same conflict. 98. The Lincoln County War is where Billy the Kid steps fully into the story, and where the gap between the exhausted teenage cowhand named Henry McCarty, who also signed himself William Bonney, and the immortal outlaw Billy the Kid yawns widest because the actual documentation of his life is surprisingly thin compared to the mountain of legend that piled up afterward. We know he drifted through foster homes and jail cells in the East, surfaced in New Mexico as a wiry youth comfortable with both Spanish and English, worked as a ranch hand and horse tender, and then got pulled deep into factional violence as one of the regulators tied to the Tunstall-McSween side, participating in at least some killings, but almost certainly not the dozens the tabloids and later movies claimed. Contemporary newspapers alternated between portraying him as a demon and a folk hero, sometimes inflating his age, his body count, and even his literacy to suit whatever story they wanted to sell that week. And by the time Sheriff Pat Garrett shot a young man he identified as Billy in Fort Sumner, the kid had already become a kind of frontier Rorschach blot, praised by some Hispanos who saw him as standing up to a corrupt Anglo ring, denounced by territorial officials who needed a clean villain to reassure Eastern investors, and forever after recreated in novels, plays, and films that stitched guesswork, rumour, and pure invention into a seamless myth that feels detailed mainly because generations of storytellers kept filling in the blanks. 99. While newspapers obsessed over headline-grabbing figures like Billy, A quieter, more mundane struggle played out mile after mile across open rangerland, where thousands of mostly anonymous cowboys and ranchers wrestled with a basic economic problem that doesn't fit easily into ballads. How do you prove which half-wild animals are yours when they're scattered over unfenced country, and any neighbour or stranger can nudge part of the herd over a ridge and vanish? Brand registries, roundups, and trail bosses helped, but with cattle roaming across vague boundaries and through remote canyons, theft was easy to attempt and hard to prosecute, especially when sheriffs were underpaid, overextended, or beholden to powerful local stockmen. In response, big ranching outfits and regional stock growers associations pooled money to hire range detectives, sometimes Pinkertons, sometimes freelancers with more grit than scruples, whose jobs blended bookkeeping, scouting, intimidation, and occasional gun work, tracking suspicious shipments, trailing small bands of rustlers, testifying in court when cases materialized, and, critics argued, acting as private enforcers who could just as readily pressure small settlers, fence cutters, and independent operators as actual thieves. In that world, a misread brand, a disputed calf, or a conveniently lost bill of sale could tip a family from marginal stability into disaster, and the range detective's presence, like so many institutions in the West, was both a tool for order and a reminder that law often arrived wearing a company badge. 100. By the time those detectives were riding the last long trails in the 1880s and 1890s, the material conditions that had produced the frontier as a lived experience were already collapsing under railroads, barbed wire, allotment policies, reservation systems, industrial mining, and urban growth. But the cultural appetite for frontier stories was just getting started, so the same era that saw the Census Bureau declare the frontier line closed also witnessed Buffalo Bill Cody packaging his own. Carefully edited memories into Wild West, shows that toured the United States and Europe, staging choreographed Indian attacks, cowboy rescues, and sharpshooting exhibitions for audiences who would never sleep in a sod house or ride night guard on a storm-spooked herd. Dime novelists churned out lurid tales of desperados and noble scouts, often recycling each other's plots and real people's names, and newspapers that had once reported on mundane details like freight rates or water disputes recast those events as grand morality plays after the fact, smoothing over the boredom, bureaucracy, and moral ambiguity that had actually characterized much of frontier life. Indigenous nations, Mexican communities, Chinese laborers, black cowboys, and working-class women, central to the real 19th century West, were pushed to the margins of these manufactured legends, which turned a complex, ongoing history of conquest, adaptation, and survival into a nostalgic backdrop for stories about rugged individualism. And from there, the myth only thickened, moving into silent films, pulp westerns, television series, and tourist brochures, so that by the early 20th century people were already visiting Old West towns built partly to mirror movies that had been inspired by earlier towns, walking through a hall of mirrors where memory, marketing, and entertainment kept reflecting and reinforcing each other until the frontier lived more powerfully in imagination than it ever had in the hard, dusty present of the people who once called it home,